and oral histories are not. But for a lot of cultures, oral history and what's in memory or songs or music, those things are authentic ways to know things. Anyways, so, and it's also generations of people with the relation to the land. So it just really applies well to looking at Jibaro, or the majority of the people in Puerto Rico that were living in the mountains. So then, no, get into my region. And again, this is all repeating what I just said, so just forget about that. This is just a little bit more about the Jibaros that comes from the oral history. So this again is just who the majority of the Puerto Rican people could have been. One thing about Jibaros is that I'm not an expert on Jibaros, but as I showed, there were a lot of different places, a lot of different areas on the island, so there could potentially be a lot of different types of Jibaros. Okay, one of those scholars told me something like 90 different types he found or something. But someone who did oral history found things like they had language, they had their own language, and this is in the early 20th century. Okay, so this would be like grandparents or parents of people interviewed through oral history. And I'll just say now, since I'm thinking of it, about oral history, for the critics, the people who critique it, a lot of this, there's a couple different people who have done oral history over decades and over a lot of different areas. And if the stories match, it seems to me, I mean, I'm not an expert on oral history either, but it seems that if a lot of different stories match, that it's not just people making stuff up. So, you know, they knew their agriculture very well. One of the claims that the Americans made in Puerto Rico is that they had no food. They were all starving, but I'm not an expert on that either. But I know at different times they exported food to, so I heard a talk once about that. Puerto Rico exported food to Dominican Republic. Have you ever heard that? But anyway, so they did know how to work the land, and so this is just their identity was, the Spanish put an identity on, well, no, not the Spanish, the United States. I mean, the United States, when the Institute of Puerto Rican Culture, when the schools were being started, and they were administering the whole island, they kind of put this identity on them as being Spanish or white, and then they were made into Puerto Rican. Nobody, I don't know about Neo-Taino groups, but none of the people I read claim that the Jibaros are Taino, so they just had a way of being and a way of living. About rural education, I just wanted to say that they made the Segunda Unidad school in the rural area. In the rural areas, it was meant to be civilizing as well as a community center. This was an American project for teaching people about hygiene and how to eat and things like that. And it was there were different programs like that for rural education. So then this is just a picture. They were community centers. They were trying to teach people not to have kids, not to move to the city. So I have way too many slides. Does anybody have any questions? This is all just kind of like background stuff.
Plenty of questions. We're just waiting for you to land.
Yeah, really? I'm sorry, because I had 18 slides and then I got it way up to too many. But I'll just skip over this. This is just stuff I already said. So now, these are the policies that I analyzed. I'm not going to go into them in so much detail because now with all that background, which like blew my brain away for like 2 years, I took these policies that are in effect now. I just chose them because either they're in, like teachers right now have to deal with this, or they're, you know, the Department of Education has to deal with this. This is still something old. The Lake Mohawk Conference, those are old, but so forget about this one. But the Spanish language policy, I still didn't sort out, I'm sorry, but they, in the government, in the court, they still have English. The schools are supposed to be bilingual. Mostly people are not bilingual. So mostly everything is in Spanish. This is the federal law, No Child Left Behind, which most people have probably heard of. I put that down there, because I decided to put the Puerto Rican ones first. So even though they have to abide by this, they have their organic law, and then these are two cartas circulares that are in effect, one for social studies and one for Spanish. So I looked at those. And then as far as teaching culture and teaching identity and teaching about indigeneity, but ultimately they have to abide by No Child Left Behind. This one I'll talk about later, the Native American. Oh, no. No, sorry. No, nobody speaks English. I mean, no, some people speak English, but I mean, everything is in Spanish.
Okay. So, I guess I got confused because I thought you were saying in the schools, they're not teaching Spanish, or you said not bilingual, meaning they're not teaching.
Yeah, no, they teach English, but it's a very poor quality, and people aren't bilingual.
But the teaching of Spanish is also of poor quality, so that your children did not learn Spanish.
Yeah, they didn't do Spanish as a second language. No, I probably said it too fast. Like, during the years, sometimes English was supposed to be the language of school.
Okay.
And other times Spanish. After, like, 1952, it's been Spanish, but...
So your kids were learning, so Spanish is what the teacher was teaching everything in your kids' school, but it was just a poor version of Spanish?
Well,
no, it was just Spanish.
all the disciplines were taught in Spanish.
Yeah.
But that was not a way for the children to learn Spanish properly, I suppose. And the Spanish class was not nearly as good as it should have been.
Well, the Spanish class was like an English class here. I mean, like Spanish, like language arts. It would be Spanish for the kids who already knew Spanish. They didn't do very good on Spanish as a second language.
What did the kids speak at home?
My kids?
Going to these schools. No, the kids who were getting
Puerto Rican kids.
Oh,
Puerto
Spanish.
Rican kids who were getting this bad education. They spoke bad Spanish, or they spoke Latino, or they.
No, they
Next
spoke.
year, what did they speak?
No, I'm not saying it's bad Spanish. That was what Americans said, like when they first invaded. Yeah.
They spoke Spanish.
Yeah, they speak Spanish at home, but I was just saying that especially earlier on, there were variations, like in all of Latin America.
But right now, most of them speak Spanish.
Yeah, they speak.
And glued to the cable channels, and so that's.
Spanglish.
But that's true of all of Latin America.
Yeah. Anyway, that was something that the teachers talked about too, because of No Child Left Behind, Puerto Rico has special permission to do everything in Spanish instead of English for their testing requirement. So Spanish is tested, so Spanish brings funding. That's the way No Child Left Behind works. Schools have to comply and meet test requirements, and Puerto Rico gets to do it in Spanish. It's kind of funny because Native Americans say, oh, look, they have their language. But anyways, look at what time it is now. I'm sorry. Okay, so I analyzed all these different policies, and then I found like status conflicts because the federal policies have more weight. There's ideology formation. It was standardized and homogenized. Okay, these are just some excerpts from the 1999 law. I don't really have time to talk about these, but for years Puerto Ricans fought to make the standards Puerto Rican and not American, and to get, Puerto Rican history, culture, identity in there. So they have these little excerpts in there that it should be, pertinent to the social, culture, geographic reality of the students. even though in practice this is much more difficult. In the Carter Circle Lab from a couple years ago, this is the social studies one. First two are from the social studies one that they have it in there that the teachers are supposed to teach kids about the history and cultural heritage that identify him as a Puerto Rican, and then to have a greater understanding of the historical process and social process of Puerto Rico. And then this is from the Spanish one to establish the link between history, people, society, identity, but Spanish is the mother tongue. So they do have all this in the local level laws. But then there's No Child Left Behind, which, as you may or may not know, it's just been written out, and I think they have a new one coming. I forgot the name of it. But Puerto Ricans are in the category of Native Americans. It's a 600-page document to read through, so that was a challenge. But Puerto Ricans are sometimes considered a state and sometimes not when you read through the document. Of course, Puerto Rico does not fit the definition of Indian students or like Hawaii. Hawaii is sometimes considered indigenous in the document. And then there's the flexibility plan. Puerto Rico failed, as did 42 states. They failed in the testing requirements. So the point of having this in there is just that, it's just to show the governing and the accountability in education and language, and this is what governs schools, and then that's what governs the teachers, and then the teachers, what they teach the kids about who they are. So I'm just reminding you of why I'm talking about this. But the standards, these are the standards that I chose that a social studies teacher could use, like change in continuity, people, places, and environment, personal development, and cultural identity. This is in their social, these are based on the United States social studies standards. They have a couple different ones. But given the history that I told in the beginning, a teacher could use these, and because the teachers have to align the standards. And then for Spanish, they have to do reading skills, writing, but that could be done with text. The interesting thing, in case I forget, is that they've already integrated, or should I say, they've already eliminated social studies from kindergarten to third grade, starting this year. So that was a really big thing that happened. And they're talking about doing it for older students, and it's because of testing, because they say social studies isn't important. It's because they don't integrate it, and then it makes people really mad because they say, "Oh, look, we can't learn history anymore. We can't teach them history anymore." Did you want to say something? No. Oh, so okay. So then the textbooks. I looked at the textbooks. Here's another one of those images, like in this image, the Spanish guy's on bottom. I told you there's a bunch of different images. This is the 4th grade one that's used now. I actually went through textbooks, like dozens and dozens of textbooks, like old ones that I don't know if they're still used or not, because in the Department of Education, they just opened up their library to me. But this is the one that's used now for 4th grade. So the thing about the books is that teachers have to use the standards. So this is what comes up with the teachers, is that the teachers have to start with the standards. So if the standard is about cultural identity, the teacher is not obliged to teach this as a cultural identity. If the teacher wants, she can just teach, oh, we're all white and Spanish, or we're more African. It all depends on the teacher. But what's in the book, as far as just what's in the book, is this image of the extinct Taino. They're presented with certain motifs like this. They're powerful images. These are the kind of images that you find, okay, and they've evolved. It would be a really interesting study to go through, because I found a book from 1974, for example, that has the entire indigenous history in 2 paragraphs, or 1 paragraph. It says, they welcomed the Spaniards, and then they left. The Spaniards came to enjoy the island, and that was it. But this is the Institute of Puerto Rican Culture, their little pamphlet that they give out, and they make this guy travel through time. He has to travel through time because they only exist 500 years ago. This is, I think that's the same as that other one. And this is also a common motif. unfortunately. That's from a 7th grade book. And there's another picture in the same, this is Guanina by Colitote. There's another picture of her like from the front without her shirt. So this is 7th grade. So it's also, you know, becomes kind of immoral because they're presented as being naked, savage, 500 years dead. And then with these certain motifs, like sick or working in mines or whatever. And the main thing is that they're completely in the past. Only archaeology would help you know them. There is no cultural continuity. And then for the Spanish teachers, the literature is not expected to be used. Everybody that I talk to just completely separates it. Spanish is this, it's language. Social studies is this, without even thinking about how you could integrate that with poems, with stories, with lots of things.
So maybe you're going to get to this, but I know that this is kind of about the education system, but I'm wondering, so is there like a population in the country that really considers themselves Taino and, you know, is embracing that? Or are there kind of, I'm thinking about like the Mayans, people now are kind of wanting to assimilate or, you know, take that back as their cultural heritage. Is that happening in Puerto Rico? Or?
Yeah, that's, maybe you've heard more about it than me. I actually avoided that on purpose because I heard early on that there's 22 groups on the island, and then there's a whole bunch more like in New Jersey, and all these people are like reclaiming, and they all have like different ways of doing it. Like some of them are in New Jersey doing like ceremonies and wearing feathers, and others are, there's one group that I got to know, and they call themselves just Movimiento Indígena, Jíbaro Boricua. They just call themselves, they say my grandparents lived in Caguana, which is in Utuado, and we practice, and then they had to live in the caserío, like in the projects. And
is there a language though that they spoke? Maybe I missed that.
Taino or a version of Arawak. Yeah.
So is that being still spoken in some of the?
Well, these people are reclaiming that language. There are dictionaries
people
of that language, so they can learn the vocabulary.
There are people, and there's all these different groups, but it's like another huge field of study to look at all these groups and what are they doing. Some are doing academic studies on reconstructing the language, but I was trying to get this done faster than 2 years, and I just purposely avoided them because I was trying to stay focused on, like, I'm just doing the policy and the schools and the curriculum without getting, like, because if I would have gone to meet too many people who were making these claims, it might have, you know, I don't know.
I guess maybe I wasn't really clear. I was just thinking, are there still communities in Puerto Rico where people have never really, like, they relinquished that, where they've always, like, generationally have continued speaking that language and lived with that identity? Okay.
Not really.
There are these groups that have a corporate identity, and they meet.
Okay.
And in those meetings, they perform that identity.
But there are people relearning or reevaluating or kind of rethinking about what their grandparents said or stuff like that. And so, I don't really have time to talk about him, but he is so interesting. If anybody has time to study Paul G. Miller, he is from Wisconsin, and he was a soldier in 1898 from Wisconsin. He went there, he worked in education, then he came back to Wisconsin for 5 years, and he did his bachelor's to his PhD in 5 years. His PhD is lost, by the way. They lost it from the archives. He did his PhD about a poem. I think that's so interesting. Then he went back and he was a commissioner of education, but he wrote a textbook on Puerto Rican history. And the interesting thing about it, besides that he's from Wisconsin and we can put him in that context, is that in his book, he makes the Indios really primitive and really inferior mentally, but he doesn't kill them. They just fled to the mountains. And they weren't called Taínos. So that's just kind of interesting about him. And I was trying to figure out a way to focus on him, but I didn't. These are just some of the other books. Like, I just picked some different books in my dissertation that I had found and looked at. Like, some people wrote books and they were based on all these people who did, like, anthropology of the Amazonian tribes, and they used that to write about the Indian Puerto Rico. And those books were used in schools. But through the 20th century, the books like oscillated. Sometimes they disappeared. Sometimes they were extinguished. Sometimes they just fled. Or sometimes it was just ambiguous. So it's really, it would be an interesting study to study all those books. And Ricardo Alegria, I just decided to give him a slide because he's the most famous person who gets credit for reviving the Taino. And I think after his work, that's when they started calling him Taino. This is the cover of his book. This is why I didn't focus on him, because I did not want this image at all. You know, if that's what they looked like when the Spaniards came, that's not what I was trying to focus on. Nevertheless, he is a really famous person. So, I'm just going to try to I did 28 interviews with teachers, but most of them talked about how important it is to teach history and identity, how there is no emphasis given to history. The standards govern everything that they have to do. They have to align the standards. And then, according to each individual teacher, they either spent 2 days on it or they spent 2 months. So, but they're products of the school system too. So then, but I did find with the teachers that about the Puerto Rican Spanish, that there still are variations. A lot of teachers said that parents don't storytell anymore. A lot of them talked about traditions and knowledge that's gone. But it all varied. Everything varied between the teachers. Most of them said Taino, and most of them just followed what's in the book. So this is their main issues, is that history, they all say it's political because it's not tested. You know, Spanish is tested, and they all thought that social studies would be the place to teach. For Spanish, they said, you know, you have to really work the theme because they didn't see how it could be integrated. So anyways, my theory was just about educational imperialism, that the school curriculum was, you know, like colonized. The knowledge has been lost by this generation. I didn't have time to talk about Rabasa at all. I'm just going to skip that for now. But I already talked about all of that. So I think that's all. I think I kind of talked about my conclusions in the middle of everything. So that's all. I'm just going to stop. This is my limitation. This is a really horrible picture. Lynn Guitar took this picture, and that's in Dominican Republic, so I had to show it. I got to meet Lynn Guitar in Dominican Republic. These are just some things I didn't have. And teachers are protesting. I won't show that. There's my. Anyways, so I'm sorry there's no time. I talked too much.
Well, I just wanted to make a point here. It's very interesting, but I noticed in the rest of Latin America, they have outright U.S. takeover. We've run into the same problems in that, as regards how they view the indigenous culture and customs and languages in their education, where they also, and that recently there's been a lot more emphasis, I think, on trying to reintegrate the indigenous culture into the education. But traditionally, you know, there's been feared, all indigenous people are supposed to accept Spanish Western values and customs. So, of course, there you did have large indigenous populations that survived, like in Mexico, Guatemala, and Peru. Even in Chile, people traditionally deny that there are many indigenous traditions of Costa Rica. We have to deny it.
Yeah, that was really interesting. And that was hard sometimes to not be talking about Latin America, but I still keep it in the back of my head that it seemed like the U.S. just didn't want to deal with that. But that's another whole question.
Yes, so way back before the existence of LACIS, I took a course on Puerto Rico, taught by the Afro-American Studies Department, Richard Ralston. And even at the semester. Is he going to give a talk? That'll be fantastic.
Cuba,
Fantastic. Okay. So, in any event, your talk was much more revealing than the whole course in the sense of why there's so much confusion in Puerto Rico. Yeah, we were talking about then about, they always have an opportunity to vote for statehood or vote for independence or vote for continuation of the condominium. And I never understood why there was such confusion. And I was just wondering from your research in the area where you didn't cover the whole island, but the island that you covered, is there any geographical region that is more interested in independence or statehood or condominium, and if so, what would the reason be for that?
I have no idea. Yeah, I didn't. I
Didn't do politics at least.
I tried to stay away from that completely because I even avoided talking to professors. I just didn't want anybody branding me as anything and whatever. So Professor Scarano probably knows.
There's obviously some regional variation in this. There's one town, one municipality that has always, for the last 60 years, voted for statehood and never voted for Commonwealth, which is not the case of any of the other 77. So you have a real kind of outlier there. And now the question, I think, is about those in highland regions.
Exactly. Yeah.
I don't think that there's more independent support there than there would be elsewhere. In fact, a lot of the independent support comes from the San Juan metropolitan area, where you have an upper middle class educated sort of the university population, university related. There's a lot more pro-independent support than there would be out in the highlands.
Yeah, I also just want to mention that the idea of wanting to have a unique identity is something that's common in all countries, not just Puerto Rico.
Yeah.
But Puerto Rico particularly because it's they have such an admixture that they have to come up with some idea to show that unity and distinctness from everybody else. So I can see why that Taino movement is there. And they actually tried to learn Taino, but it's sort of like an impossibility because nobody speaks it. Even if you learn vocabulary, how are you going to converse in it?
I know, I always said that from the beginning, that Puerto Rico is the most interesting, just the best place on the earth. I always loved it so much, but it's unique. And then here he's in Wisconsin, and I'm like, get me out of Wisconsin. But anyways.
I wonder where you're going to go next. Do you have further plans?
Yeah, that's a good question. I have all these great ideas that I would like to do if I could live there, like teacher training workshops, even teacher training workshops on how to negotiate the standards and how to deal with them, and or this historical stuff, because a lot of them do look for different materials and stuff. But I had to come here for my kids to go to school, so I don't know. I'm going to publish this really soon. I have a publisher. I'm going to publish it as a book and try to. The interesting thing that I thought about my study is that it could be applied to different groups. It could be applied to different immigrant groups or different cultures, or even in Puerto Rico, different questions. There was actually one study similar to this that he sent me about the African thing, like how are Africans, you could look at a lot of different questions.
I'll even take this and use it for helping to integrate into some of the history books that we use in the U.S. to give people a different perspective.
Yeah. But my take on it was that a lot of kids go to school and end up learning what they are, like Muslim kids. Muslim kids have been learning for like 15 years that they're terrorists. Or, even African. Or what do Puerto Rican kids learn about themselves here? That would be an interesting question, because there's so many Puerto Rican kids here. Who do they think they are? What do they think it means to be Puerto Rican? That would be interesting. There's a lot of different things like that. So I hope I can find some job where I can teaching or something. But otherwise, I don't really know, except that I'll publish it. Oh, and then there's like SlideShare. A lot of teachers use SlideShare for resources, and I thought about making a couple PowerPoints and sharing them.
I thought it was very interesting that they eliminated social studies, the curriculum.
Yeah.
And it's late for a discussion, but I was thinking there might be a reason besides economics or whatever. How do you design a curriculum to integrate all this in social studies in this place where the whole place is divided, the ones where it's state and the other ones in state?
Yeah.
What do you teach these kids?
that was another limitation. Like if I would have had time, I should have looked more into teacher preparation and how much they have to learn to teach it.
Yeah, and what do they teach?
Well, if I may interject here, that it's a terrible thing what they did, and in fact, the association of.
So I heard a talk once about that. Puerto Rico exported food to Dominican Republic. Have you ever heard that? But anyway, so they did know how to work the land, and so this is just their identity was the Spanish put an identity on, well, no, not Spanish, the United States. I mean, the United States, when the Institute of Puerto Rican Culture, when the schools were being started, and they were administered, and again, this is all repeating what I just said, so just forget about that. This is just a little bit more about the Jibaros that comes from the oral history. So this, again, is just who the majority of the Puerto Rican people could have been. One thing about Jibaros is that I'm not an expert on Jibaros, but as I showed, there were a lot of different places, a lot of different areas on the island, so there could potentially be a lot of different types of Jibaros. Okay, one of those scholars told me something like 90 different types he found or something. But someone who did oral history found things like they had language, they had their own language. And this is in the early 20th century. Okay, so this would be like grandparents or parents of people interviewed through oral history. And I'll just say now, since I'm thinking of it, about oral history, for the critics, the people who critique it, a lot of this, there's and oral histories are not, but for a lot of cultures, oral history and what's in memory or songs or music, those things are authentic ways to know things. Anyways, so, and it's also generations of people with the relation to the land. So it just really applies well to looking at Jibaro, or the majority of the people in Puerto Rico that were living in the mountains. So then, a couple different people who have done oral history over decades and over a lot of different areas. And if the stories match, it seems to me, I mean, I'm not an expert on oral history either, but it seems that if a lot of different stories match, that it's not just people making stuff up. So, they knew their agriculture very well. One of the claims that the Americans made in Puerto Rico was that they had no food. They were all starving, but I'm not an expert on that either. But I know at different times they exported food to